Hey YouTube, what's happening? A question I get from time to time is, what are those wrenches and why did you choose those wrenches, being that they're obviously my go-to wrenches since they're hung on the wall, rendering them the most easily accessible? Well, to answer the question, these are vintage Craftsman wrenches from the early to mid 90s. And these are kind of special, not just because they're still made in America and arguably higher quality than some of the tools that Craftsman has put out over the last couple of years, but these are kind of special because they have an interesting story of where they came from and how I came to acquire them. Now, this is kind of fitting, being that it was Veterans Day a couple of days ago, and these happen to be Air Force tools. These Craftsman wrenches were used by mechanics in the Air Force to work on Air Force equipment in the early to mid 90s and were phased out in the early 2000s. And I was there for that phase out. That's right, these were the tools I used as a mechanic in the Air Force to work on heavy equipment, cars, trucks, and other pieces of various equipment. So what happened, and this is my theory, is that Craftsman was always famous for honoring the warranty, right? You could take a Craftsman tool and take it back to Sears and they would give you a replacement, no questions asked. At least that was the legend and the history. Well, from what I read, that started to be a little bit less the case in the mid to late 90s, and Craftsman started not always honoring the warranty, especially in cases where the tools had seen hard use in a professional environment. So my theory is that the Air Force started phasing out the Craftsman tools and getting, obviously lucrative for Mac, that is, contracts with Mac and in some cases Snap-on, but mostly Mac tools. Because I want to say in the early 2000s, we started receiving brand new, fully lined out, fully stocked toolboxes from Mac tools with laser etched inventory numbers in them. Speaking of inventory numbers, you're going to see something kind of interesting with that in a minute, being that many of these tools, you'll see have that ground mark. So that was because when the Air Force went and got these tools initially, they would just take a little tool etcher and etch on their own inventory numbers. Whereas when they gave the contract to Mac Tools provided all those fully stocked toolboxes with already laser etched tools. So that's kind of my theory and the history behind these tools. In the military, there's a thing called the DRMO, where when they phase out equipment, they can send it there, and then people can go and buy those tools from the federal government, from that branch. And that was how I got a lot of these tools. And, some of them might have just walked out because my sergeant let me. Hopefully we're too far down the road that the federal government will come after me for taking their wrenches, but that's how I got these wrenches. These were my wrenches in the Air Force, and then I went on to use these wrenches to work on Toro lawn equipment, John Deere tractors, Kubota equipment, and then during my time as a school bus mechanic, as I finished my career as a mechanic before I used my GI Bill to go back to school. So let's take a look at some of these wrenches up close and go from there. Well, here they are up close from a time when Craftsman was still made in America. You can see that this 3/4 inch wrench says forged in the USA, and it has the two alternating V's and then the actual number of the part number. Again, these were actual Air Force issued tools in a refueling maintenance shop that had inventory numbers that were ground off with a Dremel at some point. They had the raised, I don't know what you referred to as, bevel that some people complain about Craftsman tools from this era. Never bothered me one bit. I just didn't even really think about it. And I was a professional mechanic for 6 years using these. So you can see this 10 millimeter, and we brought out the 10 millimeter and the 3/4 just because these are some fairly common sizes. It's kind of interesting. When I worked at the corn wet milling plant in Iowa, back in the day, almost everything was set up where you could take anything in the plant apart with a 3/4 wrench. because most of the bolts and nuts were 3/4, which is a great way to standardize your operation. But you can see these have been well used, and these were Air Force DRMO tools. In some cases, my sergeant just let me take some of them. Wasn't really supposed to, but I think we're far enough down the road where the federal government's not going to come after me too much for taking a couple wrenches back in the early 2000s. But here's an 11/32, and you can see that it also has the ground marks. Now, there was some of these in my set that I didn't have the sizes for. There's gaps, which is why some of mine I have mixed. Some of them, the 12 point, you can see that this doesn't have the ground mark on it. This was not an Air Force tool. This is something that I got after the fact, around the same era, obviously. Now, I think I failed to mention earlier that the alternating V and the part number indicates that this is a 1990s Craftsman hand tool, from my understanding. Earlier ones would just have a V and the part number, and then earlier ones than that would just have a V, which are probably the most desirable Craftsman hand tools. These do the job for me and always have, which is why they are my mainstays. Now, are there better wrenches out there? I'm sure there are. But these are, I've had them for years. They still work. There's no reason to really replace them. Hopefully you enjoyed this look at some of these vintage Craftsman tools and a little bit of the history behind them. That's it for now. If you're not subscribed, be sure to subscribe and like the video, and we'll be back for more in the next one. Later.